It is year 2024, and we have been using the Sony PXW-FS5 for a few years now. The FS5 was released in late 2015, and now it is close to 10 years old compared to current sensor technology. We have a pressing need to find out if we should still keep the FS5 in our current inventory, or phase it out and replace with the newer Sony FX30 cameras. Is the Sony FS5 still a relevant camera in 2024? The purpose of this test is to determine and convince ourselves if it is time to let go of the FS5 and move on. We rigged everything to be as similar as possible. Sony FS5 in its maximum 4K 25p 420, 8-bit, XAVC 100 megabits per second capture. Picture profile turned off. Using the same Sony 18 to 105mm f4 powered zoom lens, locked at 18mm wide, f4.0 aperture, color temperature set at 3000K, we compare footage with the FX30 in same shooting codec. Rec 709 mode. Ramping through the ISO, starting at 800, which was the baseline for FS5, here is the footage for comparison. Without jumping to any conclusion, our first impression is that the FS5 noise level at ISO 800 is much lower than the FX30 at ISO 800. The color saturation of the FX30 is much more than FS5. We can tell that the image coming out of the FS5 doesn't look as sharp in details, the contrast and latitude is a tiny bit lower, but the image still holds up to the FX30. Here in the side-by-side compare, we attempt to grade the footage to match one another. With careful consideration not to mess with introducing more noise to both footage, based on waveform readings, we grade the FS5 by increasing saturation, matched the black levels, and pushed up the highlights, while we grade the FX30 footage by reducing a bit of saturation. Even after pushing the FS5 footage, surprisingly, we think that the FS5 footage is still cleaner and can still hold up to the FX30. Let's move on to the next ISO setting at ISO 1600. All the other parameters remain constant. Now that there's a reference image for comparison, we think that our observations at ISO 800 holds true. FX30 footage looks quite noisy, a bit saturated on the colors. The FS5 still looks a bit underexposed, but the noise level seems to be a lot more controlled, grains are finer and the image still holds up well in terms of highlight, latitude, color, sharpness, and details. Just a bit lacking in saturation. Here's a quick compare of noise between the FS5 at ISO 1600 versus the FX30 at ISO 800. Compare the noise level in both footage, and we still think the FS5 looks cleaner. Now, let's move on to ISO 3200 to observe the footage characteristics and how the camera's response to the scene. We look at the highlights in the flame, noise levels in the shadows, and sharpness details on the soft toy. One of the main reasons why we are a bit reluctant to let go of the FS5 is mainly in the HDSDI output capability for our multi-camera production work requirement, and more importantly, we have been very happy with our FS5 shoulder rig setup for sports production and news gathering work. We are too used to traditional E and G cameras coming from the Betacam SP, digital Betacam and P2 camera era. Here's the side-by-side for compare. The next set of comparison is at ISO 6400 for both cameras. The FS5 exposure and sensor response is getting very close to the FX30 now. The noise level and grain structures are also getting very similar. In this side-by-side, we take a quick look at the black levels on the soft toy's hair, shadow details, and highlights on the flame. Here is the graded comparison to match both cameras as close as possible, similarly being careful not to overcompensate to prevent gaining more noise to give either cameras an unfair or biased grade. This is the resulting waveform, for quick reference. We are starting to think that the FS5 can still hold up, despite being a much older camera. Generationally speaking, the FS5 is just about 2 steps behind in the cinema line, being that there's the FS5 Mark II and the FX3, FX6 and FX9 series being released before the FX30. Comparing APS-C sensor to sensor technology, codec to codec, matching color space and bitrate, we think it is fair for this compare. In this last footage test, we pushed both cameras to ISO 12800. The FX30 is starting to get overexposed on the flames and highlights, while noise levels still maintain to very reasonable levels even at ISO 12800. The FS5 is also performing very well, but more noise is starting to show up at the black and shadow areas. Still impressive and holding up the footage very well. In conclusion, we think that despite being a 10-year-old camera, approximately 2 generations back in terms of model release, the FS5 is still a worthy camera to keep in our inventory. No hurry to get rid of it and fully adopt the FX30 system for now. We leave you with a last compare at ISO 800 for the FS5 versus ISO 400 for the FX30. One-stop difference in sensitivity. Just to satisfy our curiosity to determine if our observations are correct. Noise to noise, shadows to shadows, and sharpness to sharpness for comparison before we end this video. We think we have achieved our purpose for conducting this test, and hope that the video is useful for you too.